Hello and welcome to my channel. Vaxxed Rhino here, because yesterday I got my first Pfizer shot. Yay! Today I'm looking at a video by Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity. In this video, he is responding to the question, who created God? I hope he actually takes time to seriously understand the objection rather than just being glib and dismissive. Let's go!
What's up everybody, I'm Bertuzzi. You're watching the 8th video in a playlist of videos responding to 20 arguments against God's existence.
Yeah, this is part of that series. If I recall correctly, my first ever video responding to Cameron was part 1 of that series, where Cameron responded to the statement, "There is no evidence for God," by asking for evidence that there is no evidence. In other words, Cameron thinks that there's no evidence for God. So I would then ask, what's your evidence that there's no evidence for God? It would have been nice if he could have, provided evidence instead of word games. Really, the argument ends as soon as evidence is presented, because that would conclusively refute the claim. But no, word games instead. I wonder if this one will be better.
Who created God? And how does your answer to that make any sense?
No one created God.
Oh, good! He's seriously considering the implications of that statement. That's why he's taking so long to start talking again, right? Right?
I mean, this video literally could have ended after about 20 seconds. No one created God.
Yes, everyone knows that that is what you believe. You refusing to understand the point of that question does not make you look clever for having been able to answer with a nonsensical answer in a few seconds. The fact of the matter is that a lot of the arguments for God's existence, if we apply them to God, imply that God had to be created as well. So the cosmological argument, everything has a cause, there can't be an infinite regress, therefore God was the cause. Why doesn't God have to have a cause? Special pleading, that's why. When it is reworded to eliminate the special pleading, it doesn't even get you to a God, and might not even get you to a cause for the universe. Everything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. That's nice. Now demonstrate that the universe began to exist and collect your Nobel Prize in physics. Then there's the teleological argument. Stuff is complex and precise, therefore it must have been designed. But God is complex and precise, so doesn't that mean that he needs to have been designed? Stuff like this is the point of that question. God gets out of needing an explanation due to special pleading, and apologists like to act as though they've made some profound point by engaging in this special pleading.
Does that make any sense? Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Not in light of the way the arguments for God's existence are structured.
Now, I think this question actually does raise a more interesting question. Namely, if no one created God, then why not just say that no one created the universe?
That's not quite how I would phrase it, but yeah. At this time, we cannot investigate what happened before the Big Bang. We have many mathematical models that attempt to describe it, with some resulting in a universe with a beginning and others resulting in a universe with no beginning, but in neither case is a God indicated by the model. Sure, you can appeal to our intuitions about how things work to claim that the models that have a beginning to the universe indicate that a God must have existed to begin it, but our intuitions didn't evolve to understand Big Bang cosmology, so there's really no reason to expect our intuitions to be correct on the matter.
Anyways, this is the argument that Himmet should have used. So here's how Christian philosophers normally respond to this. God's being uncaused follows from a more fundamental property that he has, namely perfection. God is a perfect being.
Perfection is really just such a subjective thing. How are you even describing perfection? What is perfection? By what standard are we measuring perfection? I know you'd probably say that God is the standard of perfection, but how can we know that he is actually the standard without some external standard of perfection to measure him against? Do we just have to take his word for it that he's perfect? Especially given how imperfect his behaviors are in the Bible. I would not call genocide a perfect action. And this actually brings up another point. Is it possible for a perfect being to create an imperfect creation? Wouldn't that make him definitionally imperfect? Unless you're willing to say that not only humans, but also Satan and his demons are perfect, then that means that God created them imperfect. Yeah, sure, they were corrupted or whatever, but wouldn't it be impossible to corrupt something that was created perfectly? Is it possible to corrupt God? If it is possible, then how do you know that he hasn't been corrupted? He committed genocide, after all. That's usually a pretty good sign of a corrupt dictator. But I feel like the answer is no. God is incorruptible, because being incorruptible would be an attribute that comes along with perfection, meaning that if God had created everything perfectly, it would also be incorruptible. This appeal to perfection creates more problems than it solves.
And it's actually incoherent to ask what created a perfect being.
Why? As mentioned, if a perfect being is doing any sort of creating, his creation will necessarily be perfect, because otherwise the creator himself would be imperfect. If God's creation was perfect, then that means that he created perfect beings, which means that it is not incoherent to ask what created a perfect being.
And I'll give 2 quick reasons for this. First, anything that could create a perfect being would have to be more perfect than perfect, but that's impossible.
Or it could be equally perfect. Why does it have to be more perfect?
Second reason, whatever can be created can also be destroyed, but anything that can be destroyed, in other words, anything that is fragile, isn't perfect.
Again, why do you come to that conclusion? Why would a perfect being not be able to create something that cannot be destroyed? I feel like you're putting arbitrary limits on the abilities of a perfect being just for the sake of making an argument.
In the case of the universe, however, there's nothing at all incoherent about asking what created it.
No, there's not, but also, at this time, there is no data indicating that it had to be created.
Sometimes skeptics and atheists respond to this by saying that Christians are sort of specially pleading for the God of Christianity, or their God in particular.
Yes, bang on. You appeal to the nebulous term perfection as the reason why these arguments don't apply to God as well, and arbitrarily make claims about what can and cannot apply to a perfect being without adequately justifying any of these claims. That is textbook special pleading. The reasons I use to get to my conclusion don't apply because reasons.
They're just sort of making up properties about their favorite concept of God and then saying that it's uncreated. But why can't we do that for the universe?
But here's where you run into issues. We're not making up properties of the universe specifically to be able to claim that it is uncreated. Cosmologists are putting together models of the universe to explain what happened before the Big Bang, and so far, none of these models is anything that points to a god, so cosmologists don't propose a god. Nobody is saying that the universe has the property of perfection, therefore it couldn't have been created because perfect things can't be created. The arbitrary properties are on the god side of the argument, and that's the whole point. To the best of my knowledge, no model does preclude a god, but also to the best of my knowledge, no model specifically indicates a god.
Why can't we just make up stuff about the universe and then call it uncaused?
I'm sure cosmologists and theoretical physicists love it when you refer to their entire field of study as just making stuff up about the universe. They are engaged in mathematical modeling. Mathematical modeling is how we predicted the existence of antimatter. It's how we predicted the existence of the cosmic microwave background radiation. It is an incredibly useful tool that has a history of, working. For you to dismiss this entire field of study is akin to young Earth creationists dismissing any science that supports evolution because they're convinced that the scientists only came to evolutionary conclusions because of their worldview. And I'm pretty sure that Cameron is not a young Earth creationist. After all, he's got a stream that, assuming I'm not completely off on my dates, just went up yesterday that is talking about evolution being evidence of design. Obviously, I disagree that it's evidence of design, but I can at least be hopeful that Cameron's not a young Earther, right?
Remember, the claim is that it's actually incoherent to ask what created a perfect being.
Yes, that is your claim, but you didn't provide anything that would back up that claim that is not entirely arbitrary. That's the issue.
Now, on the other hand, is it incoherent to ask what created the universe?
That depends on how we're looking at it. Personally, I think it's a meaningless question until we first answer the question, was the universe created? Because so far, there is no indication that it was, despite the apologists' protestations to the contrary.
And the obvious answer is no.
Right, but you're not answering the objection. You're answering a question that we don't even have evidence that there is reason to ask at this time.
Why? Well, here's one reason. If the universe began to exist, then it must have a cause.
Why? How do you know that? What does begin to exist mean? Do you have any example of anything that began to exist in the same sense that you're applying to the universe? Everything that we have experience with is essentially a rearrangement of materials that already existed, so we have zero experience with anything that has truly begun to exist. So given our complete lack of experience with things that began in this sense, how do you know that the things that began to exist have causes? What are your grounds for making this claim? It is intuitive, yes, I'd agree with that, but if there's one thing that science has demonstrated repeatedly over the centuries, it's that our intuitions are flawed. So I'm going to need more than an appeal to intuition before I accept the first premise. And then, on top of all of this, are the more than a dozen cosmological models of the pre-Big Bang universe that do not posit a universe with a beginning. On this matter, I would highly recommend watching the debate between Sean Carroll and William Lane Craig, where Carroll goes through and describes the problems with the theological arguments for God that make claims about the beginning of the universe.
So if we have good evidence for a beginning of the universe, then the universe has to have a cause, and it's not incoherent to ask what created the universe.
Yes, but also no. It may not be incoherent to ask the question, but the problem is that you have yet to provide anything that actually points to there being a who created the universe. So a more pertinent question would be, was the universe created, or is it naturally occurring? The answer to that question, as far as we can see at the moment, is that it is naturally occurring. If you want to propose God as the creator, then maybe get some apologists who are also highly trained theoretical physicists, because when I see theoretical physicists who specialize in cosmology making statements about the beginning of the universe, I do not see people invoking God as the cause. I see people putting forth models that explain it without appealing to the supernatural.
And at this point, you might be wondering, well, why think that the universe has to have a cause if it began to exist?
Yeah, good question.
The answer to that is that anything that begins to exist has a cause.
Oh, for fuck's sake. Yes, we know that you think that, and that is an assumption for premise one of the Kalam cosmological argument, but the fact of the matter is that we have, at most, one example of something that began to exist, if the universe did indeed begin to exist. When you have a sample size of one, extrapolating that out to be a universal rule that is true all the time is never a good idea.
I mean, you began to exist, right?
No, I am a rearrangement of matter that already existed. I did not have a beginning, not in the same way that we would need for the universe to have a beginning for the argument to work at any rate.
I mean, I'm assuming you haven't been here forever.
The atoms that make up my body have been here since Big Bang nucleosynthesis in one form or another. As one of my favorite children's books puts it, you are older than the dinosaurs, older than the Earth, older than the sun and all the planets. You are older than the stars. You are as old as the universe itself. And that statement, as poetic and profound as it sounds, is true of everything in the universe.
And you have a cause, right?
The arrangement of matter that led to me, the person, existing had a cause, yes, but there is no reason to think that this line of thinking is applicable to the universe as a whole.
Sure, you might think, but why does that apply to the whole universe?
It's not that I wonder why that would apply to the whole universe, it's that the beginning of the universe, if it began to exist, would not have been in any way comparable to the rearranging of existing things within the universe. Despite our use of similar language to describe both situations, the fact of the matter is that both situations are entirely different types of events.
I'll give two quick reasons for that. First, there's no, and this is, I guess, a little technical, there's no relevant difference between individuals and groups when it comes to needing a cause.
I guess, but that isn't relevant. The objection is not that the universe is a group of things, therefore it didn't need a cause, whereas individual things do need causes. It's that the type of event isn't even in the same ballpark.
So for example, this lens that I'm holding has a cause. Well, what about when I have two lenses? What if I had 1 billion lenses?
Stop. You're not demonstrating anything except for your lack of understanding of what the objection to the Kalam cosmological argument even is.
Second reason is that everything in our experience that begins to exist has a cause.
No, that's actually the main problem. It's that we don't have any experience with anything actually beginning to exist. Everything that we describe as beginning to exist is a rearranging of pre-existing material. Because we have a complete lack of experience with anything that has a beginning that isn't a rearrangement of pre-existing material, we are not in a position to make claims about whether or not such an event would require a cause. At most, we have a sample size of 1, and at this time, we do not understand the event in question well enough to draw this conclusion from it.
And that's about as good empirical evidence that you can get of anything.
Okay, let me rephrase it for you. When matter rearranges into novel forms, the rearrangement has a cause. Now, can we apply that to the beginning of the universe? Well, in some cosmological models, yes we can. In others, no, it's a completely different type of event. But in this case, we actually end up with the models that don't have a true beginning for the universe as being the ones for which we can apply this reasoning, which takes the air out of premise 2 of the Kalam. You know, that's the one where the universe began to exist?
So for these two reasons, it's pretty safe to say that if the universe began to exist, then it has a cause.
No, you're extrapolating from data about unrelated events based on the fact that the language we use to describe such events can be a bit sloppy. The fact that we use the same word to describe two unrelated events is not an argument that all the same things that can be said of one event automatically apply to the other.
But why can't we just say that the universe has been here forever, that it's eternal?
We can, and there are at least 17 cosmological models of the universe that, in one way or another, essentially do say that.
Well, I spent half an hour on the internet. I was able to come up with about 17 different plausible-looking models of eternal cosmologies.
So putting aside whether or not, the evidence actually points that direction, let's just go ahead and assume that the universe is eternal. Does that make it literally incoherent to ask what created or what explains the universe?
Well, I notice that you've now shifted from created to explains. Maybe you should have stuck with explains this whole time, as that is a much better word that doesn't assume agency where none necessarily exists.
Not at all. Assuming you have one, take a look at your smartphone. I mean, you know that your phone hasn't existed forever, right? But just let's pretend that it has.
Oh, for the love of fuck, please don't go where I think you're going with this.
Doesn't it still seem obvious that this thing has some kind of explanation for why it exists? Like, why does an eternal smartphone exist instead of an eternal computer? Why does it have this shape?
So, the teleological argument, essentially. Yeah, I get it. Can we please skip this bad analogy and get right to the argument? If you really must have this addressed, the fact of the matter is that the universe is as it is. If it were different, we'd be observing the different universe. In your eternal cell phone versus eternal computer analogy, if the computer were the eternal one instead of the cell phone, then we'd be sitting here asking why it's a computer instead of a cell phone. It is how it is, therefore God is what you seem to be getting at. I know you're probably going to end up at teleology, but this is what you've said thus far, and it's completely nonsensical.
Here's another more technical way of asking this question. The category smartphones has at least one member in it. But the question is why? Why does it have one member?
And if we ignore the really bad cell phone analogy and focus back in on the universe, the answer is we don't know. That's the honest answer. I get that some people are uncomfortable with that answer, but ultimately that is the answer. Apologists love to stuff God in there as though that answers the question perfectly, but the fact of the matter is that using God as an answer there is 100% assumption.
Why isn't it not just empty? It seems perfectly possible that it could be empty, so why isn't it empty?
Well, if it were empty, then we wouldn't be here to ask the question. Now, sure, that doesn't actually answer the question, but like I said, we don't know the answer to that question at this time. Maybe the bouncing cosmology is right, and every time a universe ends, another universe begins with slightly different properties, and so we exist in the iteration that it is possible for us to exist in. Maybe the nothing that existed before the singularity was unstable, and so a universe was inevitable. Maybe one of several dozen other cosmological models is correct. Maybe none of them are correct, and we'll find the correct model sometime in the future. Maybe none of them are correct, and it is impossible for us to find the correct model. Us not knowing the answer does not indicate that a God is an adequate solution to the problem.
Saying the phone has existed forever is just sort of saying well, the category isn't empty. But that doesn't explain why it's not empty.
And not having an explanation for why it's not empty does not automatically make your non-explanation the correct explanation. And let's be real here, God is a non-explanation. It is capable of explaining everything, but there's no mechanism being proposed, no test that it could undergo to see how plausible it is, no method of falsification. Any explanation that explains everything in this way is no explanation at all.
And so now ask yourself, are any of these questions that I'm asking literally incoherent?
Incoherent? Maybe not. Irrelevant? Absolutely. That's the thing though, nobody is saying that it's incoherent to ask who created the universe or why the universe exists instead of nothing. The problem is that the honest answers are that we don't know the answers. You pretending that you do know the answer is not helpful.
Do they lead to some kind of contradiction?
Not inherently, but they also don't lead to a god.
Not at all. And so it follows that the universe and a perfect being, or God, are not on par when it comes to explanation.
No, you're right, they're not. For one, the universe apparently and evidently exists, while a perfect being like God does not. But if I grant you this distinction and allow for the potential existence of a perfect being like God, then that still leaves us with the problem that perfection, ultimate perfection, should only be able to create other perfect things. And since your definition of perfect included being eternal and uncreated, then that means that if a perfect being created the universe should be eternal and uncreated. So we bump into a bit of an internal contradiction there. Because if a perfect being creates something and that creation is imperfect, then how can the being that made it be perfect? Can we expect less than perfection from a perfect being? Why would that be the case?
To summarize, we saw that it was really easy to respond to Hemmett's original argument.
No, you saw that it was easy to dismiss it without addressing it. You then engaged in a bunch of assumptive reasoning to conclude that the arguments that apply to the universe can't possibly apply to God because of arbitrary reasons that are just assumed to be the case.
Who created God? No one. Does that make any sense? Yes.
Not really, not if we apply the same logic to God as we do to the universe to get us to a point where the universe needs to have been created by a god. At this time, you have not given adequate reason to not apply the same logic to God.
So then we looked at a more interesting, more philosophically interesting question. If no one created God, then why can't we just say the same as for the universe?
Yes, and then you completely misunderstood the objections to not applying the same logic to God, thereby creating straw men of the actual objections and answering the straw men instead of the real objections. And that's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Mark Colton, who says, "I'm amazed by creationists. The flood is a perfect excuse to scratch all extinct animals off the list, but they don't use it." Well, Mark, that's one of the problems inherent in creationism. If you insist on a literal interpretation of Genesis, then you think that all the extinct animals were created with humans, and most likely would have survived at least to the time of the flood, which means that when God told Noah to take 2 of every non-marine creature on the ark, then everything that was still alive at that time had to be accounted for, meaning that the flood can't be why they went extinct. So it's one of many creationist catch-22s. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the perfect beings who created the imperfect universe that is my channel. If you'd like to be logically incoherent, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description. If you'd like to listen to my videos in podcast form, the link for that is also in the description, as well as links to my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. Go get yourself vaccinated next time!